Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. We are very excited you could join us for Navigating Trade Compliance, a guide for U.S. manufacturers. I am Matthew Haber. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Cofactor. I will be your host and confidant and friendly guide for today's session. Before we dive into the main topics, let's just run through some housekeeping items that I've been given to tell you. So first of all, session's being recorded, so don't worry if you miss anything. We're going to try to cover a lot. We'll send a recording. You can listen to it on loop, maybe 2x speed, as much as you want in perpetuity. If you have questions, amazing. Drop them in the Q&A chat. We will do our best to tackle them during the Q&A session. If we can't, Phil will personally send you a carrier pigeon with an answer afterwards. Lastly, this is a reminder that the information in this webinar, including materials, discussions, Q&A, everything, is generally informational and educational, ideally entertaining, and that it is not legal advice, even if it comes from a really smart sounding lawyer. Standard disclaimers apply here. Now let me introduce our fantastic speaker / collaborator who is going to walk us through all of this. It's Phil Haney. He is a practicing firearms and international trade compliance attorney with a long career of leadership in both business and as an officer in the Air Force. His particular intersection of the law and business of controlled goods manufacturing experience comes from aviation and firearms manufacturing. His specific emphasis is creating and maintaining legal compliance programs, using his expertise to translate mandatory legal requirements into practical advice for highly controlled goods and technology businesses. Phil has spent over 20 years helping a bunch of major U.S. defense contractors manage their import and export licensure for controlled goods, technology, and services for both commercial EAR and defense goods ITAR. Phil, thank you so much for being here. Speaking for myself, I've seen an awful lot of information and swirl around global trade and tariff management recently. I'm sure everyone else has as well. We're fortunate at Cofactor to have Phil as a resource for the past few years, working with us on these issues. And as we are not selfish, we thought it'd be a cool opportunity to share some of Phil's knowledge with our community. Today's webinar is going to be a crash course in navigating trade compliance. We're going to go through, tariffs decoded. We're going to work on trying to translate some of the government speak into plain English so you understand, what is being talked about. We're talking about country of origin. This is one that seems simple, but just keeps tripping people up in my experience. We're going to talk about, what even is country of origin, things like that. Compliance strategies that, don't suck, trying to get out of textbooks and into the real world as much as possible. How, tech can help a bit. This won't be too much of a Cofactor advertisement, but, I've been told I have to mention some of the areas that we can help with this. And then also just kind of a bit of industry specific stuff around electronics, automotive, machinery sectors, some of these areas that are facing the biggest tariff challenges. So without further ado, Phil, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it.
Anything to add? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sweet. Let's dive in. So I'm going to start with one that seems really simple, and I think, should be simple, but I frequently see people not really understand what this term means and how it applies. So that term is country of origin. So Can we just start off? Can you explain to me what is the country of origin of something? What does that term even mean technically?
So, on its face, it is what it sounds, country of origin, where this, good or idea, tech data information is coming from. So nominally, it's one place. So for example, you manufacture some widget in the United States. It doesn't matter necessarily where the substrate material comes from, but if you take this block of iron and you make it into a sprocket, then that sprocket's has a country of origin in the United States. So that's the base level answer, and it makes sense, right? I'm sure you have some experience from why this gets sticky, so I'll let you take the next part.
Yeah, I've the audience and I have two follow-up questions to this. One is, when does the country of origin something change, right? So in your example, we start off with a block of iron that has a country of origin of wherever it was processed, presumably refined from ore. And then I'm machining it into a sprocket, and that's changing the country of origin of this chunk of metal from wherever it was originally from to now wherever my machine shop is. What do I have to do to change the country of origin of something? How much, what counts?
Yeah, so we'll continue with the analogy and we'll add a couple different steps, right? So let's say that iron ore came from let's just say Iceland. We'll just pick Iceland, and the iron ore, mining company exports it to Canada, right? So they have exported, with their classification, just raw ore out of the ground, and they will pay whatever duties or tariffs may or may not exist in today's environment to Canada. Canada will then take that, and now let's say it's a smelting manufactory, and they will actually make that iron into steel, right? So they will now combine it with whatever the materials are, and it will be pick your grade steel, and it'll be just that block, right? And it could be variety, it could be an extrusion, it could be any number of things. So now let's just say you have this block of steel. What's happened is called a substantial transformation. You've gone from one type of product to another, right? So it's kind of easy to see you have added these different materials, you've gone through a chemical process, physical process, and you've made the ore into steel. Now, the Canadian Steel Company then goes, oh, hey, I have orders for Schwinn Bicycle in XYZ, town in the U.S., and we're not going to talk about tariffs yet. Let's just think, there's no tariffs in place. I'm going to, export that. I'm going to send that down to the bicycle manufacturer in the U.S. They export it. Now they've got that steel. Now they then, CNC machine it. And cut it, and that block of steel becomes 10 different bicycle sprockets, right? And so now you've done another substantial transformation, right? So the country of origin for the ore was Iceland. The country of origin for the steel was Canada, because it was transformed there. The country of origin of that sprocket is the United States, because you had another substantial transformation from the ore or from the steel into this bicycle part, right? And so now you go, well, what if that bicycle has a sprocket that was made in the US, a handlebar that was made in Mexico. And so that's where it gets a little more complicated, right? And so now you have to look at like the amount of value of like what is put into the labor and the know-how and the actual physical value of the goods. And you're able to do an estimation on like what the country of origin is. And for something to get like a made in USA symbol, there's actually like standards behind that US government puts in place. You have to have like a majority of provable content to be substantially transformed into like that US product. So if there was enough sprockets and the frame and the cabling and all that stuff overcame the value of the handlebar from Mexico and maybe the grease from China and all those things that go in together, you could say you have a bike made in the United States. That would be the bicycle's country of origin. The build of materials might have different COOs, right? But that percentage, you would then get calculated to see if you could actually pass the test and put that made in America stamp on it.
Yeah, two follow-up questions. One is, so like in our bicycle analogy, if I'm sourcing all of the parts that go into my bicycle, like the frame is made in Mexico, the handlebar is made in China, the sprocket is made in Canada or whatever, it doesn't matter. But like none of them are made in the US. None of those individual pieces are made in the US. I bring them all into the US. I pay whatever the applicable import tariffs are on each of those items, understood, right? And then I assemble them together into my finished bicycle. Is that a substantial transformation in the assembly process or no?
It is not, right? So you'll look at what the value of that assembly is, and yeah, there'll be some amount of value add to your actual end item, but you'll see it all the time. You will see like your iPhone. It says designed in Cupertino, but made in at Foxconn in China, right? So it's the same idea. They will try to, from a marketing perspective, try to show the U.S. angle. So they will say, parts from Mexico, Canada, China, wherever, but it'll say assembled in the United States. So they will, but it can't say made in America, right? So there's a very
right,
and they enforce that. It's a very specific distinction.
right. And so setting aside the marketing side of where I'm saying something was made, from a tariffs perspective, when I'm paying tariffs to import something into the US or into any country, the tariff schedule is going to apply based on what the country of origin of the thing I'm importing is. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, the country of origin and the materials, right? Famously, like, tariffs on Chinese steel, right? There wasn't tariffs on everything broad-based across the board for China. We're seeing more of that now. But like before with the first Trump administration, there was the steel tariff, and you didn't hear a whole lot of other types of tariffs because they were trying to, enact some protectionism for the U.S. steel industry. So it's not the origin, but what the goods are. So not everything necessarily has a broad-based tariff.
Got it. And so to sort of put a pin on that, the thing I need to worry about when I'm trying to determine what's my tariff burden going to be on some item I'm bringing to the US is where that item essentially was last substantially transformed, right? It
Correct.
does
Yeah.
not matter where I'm shipping it from, right? So if it's in a warehouse in Canada or a warehouse in Mexico or a warehouse in England, none of those things really matter. What matters is where was it last materially or substantially transformed? And that could
Yeah.
those all three of those could have widgets that were made in China, for example.
Yeah, and we can get more complicated with the when you talk about like where's the warehouse? Is that a special economic zone? There's all sorts of more
Of
complicated
course. Yeah.
analysis, right, to say exactly where it's coming from. But yeah, essentially that's correct.
Cool. Moving on, how do we like even start to figure this stuff out, right? So if I'm a manufacturer or assembler or whatever, like I'm an importer of some sort in the US, where do I start to go to figure out what are the tariff implications of the materials I'm dealing with? What are their countries of origin? What are their commodity classifications, their HTSs? Like, do you have some resources? I would say like the country of origin side and the HTS side, actually like Cofactor can help a lot with that. We have a lot of that data on hundreds of millions of parts, but especially electronic parts. But for things like the tariff schedules, like where am I supposed to even go to figure that out? And is the answer just I have to talk to a lawyer?
So that is one option, but I'm a more expensive, option to go about that. There are resources, like for example, I'll name drop one that I've used, like Tradewin Networks. They are a independent outside firm that is like import export compliance people that help with like classification. So you can go to outside experts. You don't necessarily have to employ me by the hour or one of my specialists to help you figure it out. Although that might be a quick and easy and trusted option. But the first place I always recommend is talk to the OEM. If they have experience in business already in the United States, this is probably not their first rodeo. They're going to have some amount of awareness of what, unless it's their first time doing it, some amount of awareness of where their parts fall from a classification and tariff perspective, because they absolutely are paying attention to, oh, hey, we just got a 25% tariff slapped on us yesterday from, say, Canada and Mexico, right? So they will absolutely know, because it's important to their business, because the US is almost guaranteed a large market of theirs. So that's the first place I would start. And you can probably get a substantial amount of the way just by talking to your contacts and seeing what information they have, especially if they're established. If they are a new supplier, if it's new business and they're branching out and they've never, again, go back to the bicycle example, they've never done bicycle frames before, then that might be, they might not be as helpful and on that front. But that's where you now start looking at the trade wins, or if you have, people that have a customs background in your department, they might not necessarily be they might be responsible for, say, doing your import or your export logistics, but they're going to have some amount of experience. And that could not be just in your company if it's small. It could be your partner companies. You have resources to kind of point you in the right direction. But that's where you want to make sure that you actually have people that understand how you classify, a Schedule B versus an HTS code versus, what's the applicable tariffs and where you go, right? So that's where you need some more specialized knowledge. It's not something that people can't learn. It just takes time and effort. And is that where a business leader or owner's time is best spent, especially in a small organization? That's where like the tradesmen of the world come in.
Totally. Sort of piggybacking on that point about like, hey, maybe a good place to start is with whomever it is you're buying this stuff from, right? Whoever the OEM is. One thing I want to just clarify though, if I'm the importer, right, I'm the one who still is paying those tariffs, right? So they can be a resource from an informational perspective to say, well, look, we ship a lot of these. We put this HTS code on the commercial invoice.
But it's still on you to get it correct.
But
yes.
Right. But it's still on me to get it correct, right? I think that's also
So,
something that like it's kind of a semantic thing, but like I feel like it trips people up a lot where there's this perception of like, oh yeah, when we're putting tariffs on Canadian imports, right? We're not really putting tariffs on Canada. We're putting tariffs on me, the importer, who's bringing something in from Canada, right? And for obviously for political reasons, there's like an incentive to kind of describe it as if we're putting the tariffs on whomever it is we're doing the importing from. But the
right.
responsibility and the dollars actually is with me, the importer, right?
Correct. Yeah. Right. They're trying to discourage you from buying those Canadian products and instead source them from somewhere else or source them domestically, right? And so that's a barrier to entry that creates, reduce it's no longer free trade because there's a tariff, and it just makes the cost, your COGS, higher because of it. But yeah, it's on you to get it correct. You can take the advice, and it's a very good point, Matt. You can get the advice and you can look it up, but as the Russians say, trust but verify. So
For sure. How many layers down my supply chain should I be worrying about this stuff? Like if I'm building an airplane, my airplane has all sorts of sub-assemblies, and those sub-assemblies come from suppliers, and those sub-assemblies have sub-sub-assemblies, and those sub-sub-assemblies come from suppliers, and like all the way down to, a resistor
right.
that is several layers deep in the, avionics stack or whatever. How much am I responsible for all of those considerations? How worried should I be?
I
As a general
wouldn't be.
practice.
So you always it wants to pass the sniff test, right? Like we were just saying, trust but verify. But it's really just the next, order of the build of material, right? So let's just say, go back to your airplane example, which is a great example. You're making a aircraft wing, right? And so that there's a number, there's flaps, there's ailerons, there's all, there's just pieces of sheet metal and rivets and screws and bladders for fuel. All those things go into the wing of that aircraft, right? Well, there's going to be a number of I'm not going to say major subassemblies, but significant subassemblies that go into that wing that may or may not be sourced from the same places. But like the whole bladder unit, right? That is going to be one specific dedicated subassembly. Wherever you're getting that bladder unit from, that's where you can check that bill of materials and go, oh, I bounce that against it, and it says that this is, an assembly for holding fuel. That classification looks right. The materials look right. Okay, it passes the sniff test. Move on to the next one. You don't need to go, okay, now where's the rubber gasket? Where did you guys get that from? I don't think anything beyond the next order of bill of materials is really, that much of a danger to you because you've already done your due diligence on the major component you're bringing in. You're bringing in the bladder, you're bringing in the flap, you're bringing in the sheet metal. Each one of those might have their own different build of material, but as long as that's something that you would, check the COO on and then check the classification, in the end, you're going to substantially transform it into a whole aircraft wing, and you'll do your analysis again. And now, in theory, that wing's made in the U.S. if you're importing it all.
Totally. I guess the one like caveat I'd give to that, right, is like I think you're obviously correct from like from a strict compliance perspective. From a business perspective, of course, like if I want to know, am I going to be blindsided by my bladder assembly going up in price by 25% due to the tariffs being applied to the materials going into that bladder? I might need to be proactive with my suppliers about saying like, hey, it's great that I'm buying this fuel bladder from an American supplier, so I don't really have to think too much about, the tariff implications for that piece of the transaction. But like, how much is my supplier going to be impacted? And like, I have to pass those costs. I mean, if you have a fixed price contract, maybe it's not a problem. But like, if there's any sort of like, scenario in which the supplier is going to have to pass those tariffs along to you in the form of increased prices, that's where you potentially have to look a
Right.
bit deeper to try to stay ahead of these issues.
Right. And it's more of a financial calculation because who's to say that the rubber cement that you're getting for that rubber gasket, that's not supplied from the US, right? And there's a counter tariff, right? So that's like to your point, it's increasing the cost. So I think the general question of hey, we're in this new tariff environment these days. Are you seeing any, indirect or secondary, costs because of whatever's happening in the world right now? They should, it's an honest conversation that they'd be like, oh yeah, XYZ things are going up in price, or this is where I'm having to shift my manufacturing to try to avoid those costs, or my suppliers, right? So, but again, it does not hurt to ask because they, in theory, should see, oh look, that rubber cement that I was getting from the U.S. because of a counter tariff is now more expensive. The cost of my bladder is now going to go up.
Rad. Okay. Question from the audience. This is kind of like both a bit of a compliance question, but also just kind of a business question. How should we think about weighing between the examples they gave us, China and Mexico, while weighing all parameters such as manufacturing competence, tariff, shipping speed, and cost, et cetera? I can speak to this a little bit, which is I think it's like the same process you have to think about when you're weighing any supplier selection process, which is like you have to look at all those factors, right? And I think there's obviously some discrepancy between the tariff implications of making something in China and making it in Mexico. Depending on the HTS, it's like 10+% more expensive in tariff, 10 percentage points more from a tariff perspective in China than Mexico at the moment. Obviously, there's like the answer might be different tomorrow or next week or next month, as it pertains to like the specific percentages of tariffs that you're going to pay on any given HTS, um, you know, coming in from China versus coming in from Mexico. But things like manufacturing competence, shipping speed and costs, like obviously that's going to depend on what you're shipping, right? You know, chips are really cheap to ship compared to cars. And so, that's going to weigh into your calculations. And I think like we've been hearing from folks a bunch recently. Someone was just who I think is who is in the audience today was just emailing me about this morning saying like, hey, we're trying to answer these kinds of exact questions for our customer. And the short answer is like, yeah, I mean, get a spreadsheet going or get some sort of tariff modeling tool going and just look at where all your stuff is coming from and do the math, right? And then you'll have to do some kind of risk assessment. I guess, Phil, do you have anything you would add to that?
I completely agree with your analysis because in the end, it's a business decision, right? The one thing that you also have to look at is, and again, this is the more squishy side, but this is where, the lawyers do come into play. Is the geopolitical landscape looking like, right? So like we can just say broad base, things are going to get more expensive in China. We don't know exactly what all that looks like, but we just know in a Trump administration for, U.S. importers, it's going to be more expensive for, when you're sourcing in from China. So you just know that as a broad brush stroke, it's not going to get any better, right? We immediately see what has happened with, free trade with Canada and Mexico after, 30 years has now, ground to a halt. And we basically saw this coming, right? It's unprecedented, but it's here. So part of that is okay, well, where are the opportunities? Does that mean that there are, these industries popping up in the U.S. that might now want to compete because, there are suppliers that want to get in that business and try to offer it, and now it's a competitive marketplace because of the tariffs. Or maybe am I shifting to somewhere like India that's got a lot of like potentiality, and we just need to make the contacts and have the sourcing because from my other contacts I know that there's some capability there, right? Or maybe I'm looking at Japan like for like more advanced technologies. It's one of those things where it helps you when you're doing international work to be abreast of the news, to kind of see where things are blowing. Because I don't think anybody that's been paying attention to the news for the past 6-9 months is surprised that, with all what Trump was saying within him winning the election, that tariffs were going to go up on China. So that's the useful
For sure.
part.
I think the other factor that I encourage people to look at that isn't one of the parameters this asker listed is like capacity, which is like a little bit different than competence. But like one of the things we've been seeing recently is like a lot of especially kind of because people expected an increase in tariffs on materials coming from China, there's been kind of increasing demand for manufacturing service providers in Mexico, like EMS in particular. And so we've seen a lot of like backlog and capacity issues with the, PCB assemblers in Mexico, for example. Because like it takes a long time to build a new, PCB fab or a new assembly or any sort of factory, right? It takes even longer to staff it and train everyone up and get it kind of operating at full capacity. And that's definitely something like we've sort of observed in our customer experience. Is like a lot of folks are running into issues where it's like, look, maybe all the numbers point to saying you should make this in Mexico or you should make this in the US, but that doesn't mean there's actually factory capacity at the right kind of facilities to even do that, right?
Right.
And so that's definitely like, make sure you're modeling these kinds of things with like an eye towards like the realities of which factories you can even get capacity at, not just kind of a theoretical, like it'd be great if we did this in the US instead. And then you realize like, actually, what is the impact of my business if I now wait an extra 9 months to even get to the front of the line to get my thing made? That might significantly outweigh any other savings.
Anything else, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You're not making any money if you don't have the capacity.
Totally.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to open questions up for the audience. I'm going to ask you because it usually takes folks a couple minutes to like type up any additional questions. So I'm going to keep asking you some questions that people sent in advance. But anyone who's watching, please ask your questions. I will work them in shortly. Next up, this is a kind of like a nitty gritty one, but I think it's an interesting example. This person asked, if services are not a tariffed class of product, is it thus trade compliant practice to break out manufacturing billables into the materials value which would be subjected to tariffs, and the value add portion, which would be considered a separate invoice. I'm going to like add one little bit of color that like I'm just inferring based on, the kind of customers we work with and what kind of things they're doing and what kind of questions I would expect. I'm guessing they're talking about something like PCB assembly, where you have like you have this whole bomb of materials that are going into it, and then there's kind of some labor portion where you're assembling the thing. And let's say I ship all of the parts to do my assembly to Canada. There's some like assembly labor happening in Canada, and I'm getting back like a printed circuit board assembly to the US, for example. Like, how does that work with the sort of country of origin? I think we established earlier that probably doesn't count as a substantial transformation. To change the country of origin to Canada, how does the labor portion of that factor into the tariffs?
And it's interesting because before you gave the labor example, I had a different caveat. I'll address the labor one first. I mean, the labor is still value add, right? So you are adding value to the good. It is more valuable after that operation. And so you can't say that, it's just the raw components of what it costs to go out there when I shipped it out and I'm getting the same thing back. Obviously, there's some kind of value add. So whatever that calculation of that, wholesale, let's just say it's the wholesale price, or the B2B price of that PCB board, you're going to have a certain amount of that is now more valuable. That labor is baked in. That will be part of the tariff because that part is now more valuable at its second state than it was the first state. The part that you can try to separate out is the engineering know-how portion, right? So if you try to reshore some of that, so instead of the collaboration and the design work being done by the Canadian firm, maybe you have your engineers are doing it here, right? So whatever cost and value add that might have been put into the design and baked in for the Canadian firm doing the work, maybe you can do it in-house, or you have a US firm that's doing it for competitive price. Those would be ways that you could not have the value add going in because it's not flowing down from from the services that are being provided to then going over to their fab floor and putting things together, right? So if there's certain amount of the tech data and the tech services that can be separated out or done somewhere else, it is possible to reduce some of your costs. I've seen that in my space with firearms optics, where we're trying to do more stateside versus with our suppliers internationally. It's a way to reduce our cost because the overall value add from the supplier in China is less. The engineering know-how is being provided in the U.S. and it doesn't get baked into the goods. So the overall value add from the supplier is less to start with. So that's one way to legally lower your tariff burden. It's still 25%. It's just 25% of half the value.
Yeah. So I want to double click on something here. In this question, they said sort of service. This person said services are not a tariff class of product. And that's like kind of not quite right, is what we're saying, right? And I think like maybe I'll give two examples that I think kind of helps illustrate the difference, right? So like Cofactor outsources a little bit of our integration engineering work to engineering services firm in Mexico. So we have like some software engineering services that we outsource to Mexico. My understanding is we aren't going to now start paying tariffs on the invoices we get from that Mexican software engineering firm because like nothing's going through customs, nothing's crossing the border other than kind of intellectual property. Is that true? Am I right about that?
Yeah, the IP, correct. There's
right. But if the services are being performed in Mexico on a physical object and thus make that physical object more valuable in so doing, when I bring that physical object back into the US, those services are essentially tariffable by virtue of having increased the value of the physical object, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you're exactly
okay.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I think that was like it's a bit of a subtle distinction, but like an important one for folks who are thinking about these.
And then also what you'll see is those engineering services, a lot of the times they'll just get all put in on the same invoice, right? And so if you're putting in that value, they are baking that into what that part is, and that's the part where you may be able to separate it out and reduce some of that tariff burden.
For sure. A term that has been around for a long time, like a practice that's been around for a long time, a tool that's been around for a long time, and all of a sudden I feel like I hear people talking about it so much more recently, and someone asked a good question about this. Can you just explain what a duty drawback is and like why they're used, what they're used for? Again, like, since the sort of Mexico tariff or Mexico Canada tariffs were announced a month or two ago or whatever, you know, all of a sudden I've seen just like so many articles about duty drawbacks when this used to be like a little bit of a niche thing. Um, let's just talk about like what is a duty drawback? If I'm a manufacturer, when can I use them? What can I use them for?
Yeah, so if you essentially you've overpaid in some capacity. Like I'll give you a good example. You have on your base level commercial product, you have a 10% duty that is paid for that imported good, right? But as part of your services, you are also a governmental supplier. So you're a DoD contractor, and so you provide this part to the government, and the government says there's actually 0% duties from let's just say it's Israel because they're a defense partner of ours. And so what you can do is you can do a duty drawback and get that 10% back, right? Because there's an exception. It's easier for you to do the normal commercial shipment and bring it all in and not have to have separate invoicing. And you just go through the duty drawback process and properly show that, oh, hey, you know what? 50% of this import was good, was went into products that actually didn't have an assignable duty. And so now I'm going to claw that back from CBP.
Does that apply if I'm basically sending something to another country to have some like manufacturing work done on and then getting it back? So for example, like let's say I build let's use our airplane wing example again. Let's say I build my airplane wing, but there's some step where I ship some piece of my wing to Mexico, and this never was an issue because we had free trade, and so I didn't really have to think about it too much. So I ship it to Mexico. They do some sort of like non-substantial transformation, but they do something to it, and then they send it back to me, and then I keep doing my work on the wing. Um, Ideally, right? Like it used to be that was like none of that stuff involved tariffs. Now, kind of like by default, there's going to be some sort of retaliatory tariffs that the subcontractor in Mexico pays when the
Mm-hmm.
material goes from the US into Mexico, and then I'm going to pay 25% when it comes from Mexico back into the US. Am I able to do a duty drawback for the Mexican, like with the Mexican government, to say, like, hey, we didn't really keep this in Mexico. We just brought it and did some stuff, sent it back. We shouldn't have to pay those tariffs twice. Does it work that way or no?
It does not work that way. There might be some kind of exception for some kind of critical good where they make a caveat to the rules, but that's the problem with tariffs is that every time it goes across a border, it's assessed, right? And so it has a pancaking effect.
Got it. Okay. Some questions from the group. Uh, Smaller manufacturers just beginning to import components. What are the most common compliance pitfalls to avoid? I'm sure there's a lot, so you can kind of just hit the top few.
Yeah, misclassification, right? So not getting the part right, both from in this case, you're going to have your HTS code, right, for your import purposes, and then also if it's and again, I don't know if it's control or not, but someone's saying it's ER99 commercial good, like a number two pencil, when it's actually something that is a controlled semiconductor component that the State Department or Commerce Department cares about, and you didn't realize it, right? Again, now the plug cofactor, there's a lot of standard tools that they have where that's in a database, and you can bounce that information against what they do, so you have confidence in on both of those entries, right? Because it's a standardized thing. So there's tools in place. You don't necessarily have to have a professional to do it that are out in industry to help with some of that. Misclassification is probably the number one risk. And I say the number two risk is just not understanding the overall cost of what it is for your supply chain. Matt had touched upon, in manufacturing capacity or the ability for how long something's going to take. Other things are like, industrial risk. There's, it doesn't get talked about enough. Nixon opened up China in the 70s, but how much intellectual property has been sold? What is the probably trillions of dollars worth of intellectual property that's been stolen by the Chinese government from the United States, right? What has that meant in loss of real jobs and opportunities, and then also national security threat? So it's an intangible, but in the world of trade compliance, it is something that is to be considered for what you stand for as like your company, as your policy. I know it's not always about making money, and so those types of things are important to some firms. So those intangible costs are not talked about enough, and I think that they're actually very important. Again, that's more of a ballyhoo of mine, but there are other things like that aren't considered because it's not as obvious. So those are the top two, but really it's the classification is the primary one I would say that you should look at. Anything else you want to add from your experience, Matt?
Yeah, I actually want to double click on the first bit a little bit. Just real quick, can you explain for folks what EAR 99 means for anyone who hasn't heard that term before? It's like a very important one, something we see trip people up in exactly the way you're describing somewhat regularly. So it's like a big gotcha for sure.
Yeah. So most commercial products in the United States, so the number two pencil or a pen, right? We'll just talk about that. They are controlled by the Commerce Department, right? It is a commercial good. The most low level, it is not regulated, and I'll say that with a caveat. Generally, a not regulated item is the classification is ER99. It's no license required. The caveat is like you can't export pencils to say Cuba, or you can't export pencils to North Korea, right? There are some places where it would still take literally an act of Congress for you to export, pencils or bags of wheat to that country. So in general, though, if you're just doing your normal business in any basket of countries that U.S. has relations with, your normal commercial product that doesn't have any kind of strings attached is EAR 99. Now, just because it's a commercial good doesn't mean there aren't controls in place. And so I'll go back to my industry as a primary example. I come from the firearms industry. They are obviously a regulated good, and so the Commerce Department has a very clear delineation of who an U.S. arms manufacturer can export semi-automatic pistol to. And so that is a commerce control item, but has a very specific classification. It is not EAR 99. And so there's a whole list of categories, 0 through 9. It's called the CCL, the Commerce Control List. And so it, aircraft components, small arms, nuclear material, semiconductors, chipsets. There's high technology items. There's so many products that are on the Commerce Control List that it's dizzying. But the ER99 stuff is the stuff that's no license required. You might hear NLR.
Yeah, so it's like this. I've seen folks get tripped up on this also who have some sort of global supply chain, meaning like often, for example, let's say they were doing PCB assembly in China because lots of good PCB assemblers in China, and they don't think of themselves making a defense article, right? Like we saw this with a company that was making AI accelerator circuit boards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're not specifically making these for defense applications; they're making them for like research applications. But one of the like high performance chips that they were buying from a supplier was not EAR 99, right? And so the issue there is like they can't make that circuit board assembly in China anymore, because to do so, they would have to export that chip to China to then have it assembled into a board and sent back to them. And like that requires like really onerous licensing stuff. You probably aren't going to get approved. It's just not really a practical option. That trips people up a lot. Question from the audience, which is kind of a good piggyback on this. Okay, I'm a small manufacturer. Maybe I've fallen into one of these compliance pitfalls. For manufacturers who discover they've been misclassifying products or incorrectly calculating duties, what's the recommended approach for voluntary disclosure to customs?
It's basically come clean and try to show it's an honest mistake, right? That is the right answer, right? There is a business angle to that I'm not going to give advice on of whether people think they can get away with it or not. I don't recommend that. What I do believe is that people are trying to be earnest and they make a mistake. In general, the government will work with you and try not to penalize you because they recognize that you have a process and you're doing it. But the process can't be I just bury my head in the sand and I look the other way and I trusted my customs broker to classify it for me, which he in theory should not be doing, right? So if you're trying to do it the right way and you make an honest mistake, it is if you pay any penalties, they're going to be minor and it's going to be worth the learning experience versus trying to sweep it under the rug and lie about it and get away with it, and then eventually get discovered and they start turning over rocks and look into your process and you really get slammed, and then it could be enterprise threatening. So if you make mistakes, you want to come clean, but it can't be coming clean because you didn't care or were operating from a place of ignorance. It's the default is, hey, I have a program, I've got a trade compliance scheme, I have training, I actually care about these things, but we're human beings and we make mistakes. And then you work with the customs officer, and they're people too, and they will see your earnestness. That is the right answer.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, I'm being told to wrap it up. I'm gonna hit the final question we have and I'm just gonna answer it in like 1 minute, and then it's a good piggyback into our kind of closing stuff. Anyway, the question is, when a product undergoes manufacturing processes in multiple countries, how granular should our documentation be to defend our country of origin determinations? My answer would be real granular. You should have good documentation. The answer is, if you're asking, should I have good documentation? The answer is always, in every part of life, yes, you should have good documentation. But you should also, and this is of course a plug for Cofactor, you should have tools that automate that documentation for you, so you don't have to spend a bunch of your time doing that documentation. And I will touch back on that in a second because that is a great segue into our next webinar we're offering that actually covers some of that. But thank you for joining us today for this session. Thank you so much, Phil, for all of your knowledge and time. We'll be sharing the recording of this webinar with everyone. In addition to the recording, we will share details of how to connect with Phil for a free initial consultation. If you have questions about this area, he is happy to help and see if he can be a good resource for you. This will be emailed to everyone who participated today. Additionally, if you're interested in continuing to learn about how to navigate trade compliance, particularly documentation requirements, Ed Dodd, who's Cofactor's super experienced VP of Business Development, really comes from this world. We'll be sitting down for a second session on March 27th with our friend Grant Cernick from Third Wave, which makes really cool software for managing global trade compliance and documentation, to discuss some of those kinds of practical solutions that allows engineering and trade compliance to work together, reduce the risk of custom-related delays, reduce the risk of not having the paperwork you need when you need it to be able to sort of defend these terminations. So details on that session will be included in the follow-up from today as well. I am looking forward to attending it myself, and I hope everyone joins for that as well. So again, thank you so much, Phil. Really appreciate your time. This was education for me. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.